have like a quiz from me, like maybe next week or so, you will have to list amplitude, period, phase shift, and vertical shift, midline, okay? And so that's what we're going to do in this packet as well. So we've kind of built up to this process. So for like 3, we're actually going to list all of it, even though it just asked for amplitude and period. All right. But it's important that you can determine those 4 things because you will not be able to graph it without it. It's also important because these are 5-point questions, and 4 of the points are just listing those things. So if graphing is making you struggle, that's 1 out of the 5 points, right? You really 4 out of the 5 points are knowing these things and how to find them, okay? And so you'll be asked to give amplitude, period, phase shift, and midline, all right? So my amplitude, remember my amplitude is the absolute value of the number in front of my function. So what's my amplitude here? 5. Period, how do I find my period?
2 pi over whatever's in front of x.
Right, so we say 2 pi over the absolute value of b, which is the number in front of x, all right? So in this case, I'm going to say 2 pi over pi. So my period here is 2. They do, the pi's cancel. Phase shift, phase shift. This one doesn't have one, but what is it? It's phase shift is negative c over, over your absolute value of b. In this case, my c is 0, so my phase shift here is as well 0. So what does this mean then? It means you're going to start at the point 0, 0, right? That's what that means. Your phase shift, you're not going to go left or right, okay? And that it depends on the midline too, but the midline is going to be the same for this one. So if I said midline, that is normally what? That's determined by which of your letters there? Yeah, D. In this case, my midline doesn't move. My midline always starts at y equals 0, that line, also known as the x-axis, by the way. Okay. All right, x-axis.
So your midline is the same as the phase or your
Vertical shift, yes. Midline and vertical shift mean the same thing. So let's look at this next one. My amplitude. What's my amplitude for this one? 2. My period. Yeah, it's going to be 2 pi over 3. My phase shift. Negative c. What is c here? C is negative pi, right? So it's going to be pi over 3, right? And then my midline. Where does my midline happen here? At y equals 4. I'm writing it as y equals 4 because it is a horizontal line, right? It's going to be up or down somewhere on the y-axis, okay? So y equals 4 for that one, all right? I'm going to list all of my stuff first, and then I'm going to graph it. So I'm going to list my amplitude. My amplitude here is 2, right? My period, it actually doesn't change because my number in front of my x is 1. So my period is just the standard 2 pi. Phase shift, I also do not have a c. So my phase shift, none. I do not have a phase shift because I'm not shifting. You can put 0, 0 there if that indicates, we do have a vertical shift though, so it's technically not 0, 0. My midline happens at y equals -1. So what I'm going to do then is I am going to take that midline and I'm going to go ahead and draw that on my graph as a dashed line. Remember, anytime you're graphing dashed or open circles, dashed lines and open circles means it's not technically part of the graph. It's just there to assist you with what you're doing, okay? So this line is not part of my cosine graph. It's just letting me know where I'm going to be doing my graph, okay? And then I'm going to just do my cosine. Remember, for cosine, where do I start?
Your amplitude.
I start at my amplitude, okay? My first quarter, right? Where am I for that?
0.
at my midline. And I'm going to write midline because I actually do have a different midline than 0, okay? Halfway. So at my halfway mark, where am I? I'm at my lowest, right? So I write negative amplitude. And I do that because if my amplitude were negative, like if it were a negative in front, I would actually start at the bottom and go up. So whatever the opposite is. All right, third quarter, where am I for a cosine graph? Back at my midline. And then I end at my amplitude, right? Okay?
So do we have to write that out?
All right, so I'm going to start at my amplitude. My amplitude is 2, but is 2 above what? 2 above my midline. My midline is what? -1. So if I'm here, 2 above it is going to be here. All right, so if this is my, if this is my midline, I'm going to go 2 above it, right, which is right here. So I'm actually going to start up here at +1. +1. All right, now, since my period didn't shift, my quarters are still the same, just to point that out. Start and end. Start at 0, end at 2 pi, because I didn't have a phase shift, right? And I didn't have a period change. That means my halfway point is at pi, my 1/4 is at pi over 2, my 3/4 is at 3 pi over 2, okay? So, all right, so I start at my highest amplitude. My first quarter, I'm back at my midline. My midline is here. Halfway through, I should be at my negative amplitude. If my amplitude is 2 and I started at -1, where am I going to go down to? -3. So at the halfway point, I should be at -3. 3/4 back at my midline, end back where I started for that cosine. And remember, you want to kind of mirror it over here so that you can draw through. So you can see that wave. All right, I require a full cycle, and then you want to go past it a little ways so that you can see what's happening as it continues on. All right, you don't just want to stop at that V. You want to keep going because it is a continuous graph. So you want to keep going and do some arrows there. All right, but what I'm looking for when I grade is I am looking for your start, your 1/4, your halfway, your 3/4, and your end. That's what I'm looking for. What I want you to do is I want you to draw past it with an arrow, go past it with an arrow so that you know it continues on. It is a cycle, okay? Number 11 on the next page. So you can see it's asking for all 4 things here. It has given you a graph that you are going to need to do this. And I will tell you when I give you your graphs on your quiz or test, it will be enough for you. So if you get like a graph that goes from -12 pi to +12 pi and your period is 1 pi, you probably did something wrong, okay? You know what I mean? Like use your cues on your quiz that if you have something that goes from like -pi to +pi and you get some type of like 6 pi as your cycle, and you're like, oh, I went off the graph with my 1 cycle, you probably did something wrong. Kind of like when you used to do number lines, and I said, hey, your answer will be on the number line I give you. Maybe in between 2 numbers, but it's going to be on that line, right? Use that same concept when you're graphing these, okay? So, amplitude. What is my amplitude here? 2. All right? Oh, let's write it like this. All right, 2. All right. What is my period? Okay, and I'm going to like this. Right. So I'm going to give it to you like this. Sine of 1/2 theta. Or it could say theta over 2, by the way. That's how it's usually written. It's usually written like this. Theta over 2 minus pi over 2. That's the same exact thing. But I just don't want it to confuse you with a number in front of the parentheses, okay? So it'll be written like that. All right, so let's look at then period. So period is going to be 2 pi over the absolute value of b. And what is b? 1/2. Remember, keep, change, flip. So what is my period?
It's going to be 4 pi.
4 pi. All right. Phase shift. Phase shift is -c. What is c?
C is -pi
negatives pi over 2. So I'm going to say positive pi over 2 over b, which is 1/2. All right, so this we also keep change flip, right? So it becomes what?
Pi over 2 times 2.
Times 2, which is just pi. All right, my midline, what's my midline? Y equals what?
Pi or C, D.
Yes, which is positive 2. Okay. So now I can graph. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to graph that midline. Okay. Graph this guy here. All right. If I start, so my phase shift normally starts at 0. It moved at pi. So now I'm going to start at pi. My period is 4 pi, so where am I going to end if I start at pi?
5 pi.
I'm going to end at 5 pi, okay? 4 pi, so halfway through 4 pi's will be 2, right? So that's at 3 pi. Does that make sense? My 1/4 is at 2 pi, my 3/4 is at 4 pi. So I've marked my start, my first half, third, and end. And then I'm ready to graph. This is my sine graph, all right? This is my sine graph. So let's talk about what sine graph does, all right? It starts, where do I start for my sine graph? I start at my midline. My first quarter is where? At my amplitude, right? Halfway, I am back at my midline. 3/4 of the way through, I am my lowest, right? Or depending on which way it goes. And then I end back at my midline. All right, so this is my sine graph divided. So I start at pi for this guy, and I start at my midline right here. First quarter is going to be at 2 pi. I need to go to my amplitude. My amplitude is 2, but it's 2 above 2. So where's my amplitude go to? It's a lot of 2's. Yep, all right. Halfway through is my 3 pi. Where am I for that one?
Back of the
Midline. 4 pi is 3/4. Where am I going to be for that?
little negative amplitude.
Right, which is 0 for this one because I went down 2. All right, and then I end at 5 pi where? Back there. And so it's going to look like this. All right. So the thing about these graphs is you could probably name this 2 different ways. All right.
It can be a sine.
Because
or
it,
could be a
right, he said it could be a sine or a cosine, right? So I could potentially have a cosine with a phase shift, right? Or a sine with a phase shift, just depending on what it is. Now, what I can see is my midline didn't change. Does everybody see that? So the very easiest thing to tell is your midline and your amplitude, correct? My midline for this is obviously my x-axis. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Why do I know that? Well, my highest point and my lowest point are the same distance away from my x-axis. All right? So if I were matching these, they were nice. They didn't give us a midline, but I automatically know that I don't have, my D is going to be 0. All right? So if I were to do this particular one, I would say, well, I know that I don't add anything to it. All right? Something else that's easy to see is my amplitude then. If I know where my midline is, what is my amplitude?
2.
It's going to be 2. Now, I could have a cosine graph with a -2, could I not?
Yes.
Yes. So I could have a cosine graph here, -2, right, with no phase shift whatsoever and no vertical shift. The only thing that changes is my cycle. How long does it take that cosine to cycle? Yeah, it just cycled with pi, right? Does everybody see that?
Yes.
So I can have a cosine with no phase shift. That's the easiest one to write. So if I'm asking you to write this, no phase shift is going to be easier than writing it with a phase shift, because then you have to think, what do I have? What over what equals my phase shift? Okay, I can easily see what my cycle is going to be. So that's kind of easy. If I know I'm going to say 2 pi over b to get a cycle in there, right? Everybody right? 2 pi over absolute value of b. So if my cycle takes only pi, what did I divide 2 pi to get to pi? So I know, so let's go through all of the lists. Let's do it this way. Let's do this, all right? So we'll say amplitude. Amplitude was easy. What's my amplitude? How far away from my midline did I go up and down? 2. Okay? We'll go down to midline because he's pretty easy too. My midline, none, right? It's y equals 0. I don't change it all, right? All right, let's look at period. Period was kind of easy. What was my period? Pi. If I'm talking about either one of them, actually, it's going to be pi. If I choose to do a sine graph, I'm going to have to shift it, right? Does everybody see that? Because a sine graph would start here, would it not? I would have to phase shift by pi over 4. If I do a cosine graph, I don't have to phase shift. I just have to negate it, correct? Because it started down. Does everybody see that? Okay?
Yes.
So I have 2 options here if I am writing this function. I can do a sine graph with a phase shift, or I can do a cosine graph and just make my leading coefficient negative. Which one do you think I would choose?
The negative cosine.
I would do the negative cosine without a phase shift, personally. Okay? So I'm going to say my phase shift is also none. I'm not going to phase shift at all. So how do I write this? Well, I'm going to say that my function is going to be negative 2 cosine. I'm going to choose the cosine one. All right? I want my period to be pi. My period equals, period, how do I calculate it? 2 pi over the absolute value of b. My period equals pi. What did I divide 2 pi by to get pi? 2. So what am I going to put in front of my theta there? 2, right? X theta, it doesn't matter. Does it work? So let's see if it works. My amplitude is the absolute value of this guy. Yes. My period, 2 pi over this guy. Yes. I don't have a phase shift because I don't have a C. I don't have a midline. Will it graph correctly? It will, right? I start at my lowest because it's a negative. 0, highest, 0, end. And I ended in 1 pi. Does everybody see how we went through and figured it out? Okay? So when you're asked to write a function, you can really do it, like Bobby said, you can do it with a sine or a cosine because the waves are the same. They're just shifted. One may require a phase shift. They both might, all right? This happened to start nicely right here. If this had started here, maybe either one would have required a phase shift, okay? But it didn't, so we were okay. So when you're asked to write them, you can really write it with sine or cosine, choose the path of least resistance because they will both work. They will both be accurate descriptions of the function that you've been given.